Libertad, libertad, libertad.
Liberty for Orlando Bosch. That was the cry this week in Little Havana, where thousands marched and shopkeepers shut their doors. They say Cuban militant Orlando Bosch is a hero, a patriot who should be allowed to stay in the U.S. with his family. But the U.S. Justice Department calls him a terrorist and says he should be deported. The future of Orlando Bosch, today's topic on Newswatch.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Newswatch. I'm Michael Putney. This week's developments in the Orlando Bosch case have stirred passions in our community like no other in recent months. It has also stirred ethnic divisions and reopened some old wounds. Today, we're going to talk about the Justice Department charges against the Cuban pediatrician. We'll talk about the judicial process that could free him or send him to another country, and his family says to his death. Finally, we will also talk about the political ramifications of the Orlando Bosch case. Miriam Bosch is the daughter of Orlando Bosch, one of 5 children by his first marriage. Miss Bosch speaks regularly to her father, who is being held at a federal prison in South Dade, and she speaks out frequently on his behalf with the news media. Husker Levin is one of several Miami attorneys representing Dr. Bosch. Mr. Levin's specialty is immigration law, a subject on which he has written and lectured for the Florida Bar. Mr. Levin is a graduate of the University of Florida Law School. Ira Kurzban is also a well-known immigration lawyer in Miami. He successfully represented Haitians in a class action lawsuit that was decided in their favor by the United States Supreme Court. In recognition for that work, Mr. Kurzban received an honorary law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He is a graduate of the Bolt Law School of the University of California at Berkeley. Miriam, I'm going to call you Miriam since we've known each other for a couple of years in a professional relationship. And Mr. Levin, thank you for coming. Ira, good to see you again. Miriam, if I may, let me begin with the obvious question, which is, your father this past week renounced violence, and yet he has spent his adult life advocating the overthrow of Fidel Castro, including the use of violence. Now, has he had a change of heart, and if he has, why?
My father renounced violence a long time ago, not in the past week. He wanted to fight Castro when we first got out of Cuba, and he used whatever means he did use out of a desperate situation, out of frustration, out of loss of his country, loss of his freedom, loss of religion, loss of everything that this country offers you. And not only was he involved in activities in the early 60s, but those activities were backed by the American government, such as the Bay of Pigs or CIA. There was many Cubans that were trained here for those activities, so he was not the only one involved in those activities. And since the 1968 freighter incident, which he did his time for, my father has renounced violence since then and has not been tied or committed any violent acts.
The Justice Department sort of true bill, as it were, to put it in legal terms, the accusations that Acting Associate General Joe Whitley released a week ago, however, says that he has been involved in terrorism against Castro well beyond the freighter incident, and it of course lists his participation in what is known as CORU, the acronym for the group that he founded to fight Castro, and acts that CORU was involved in up until the 70s.
Well, a lot of the accusations that the Justice Department accuses my father of being involved in are, even while my father was imprisoned, they say he was in other places committing acts. Most of them are false. The only one that is true is the one about the freighter. And my father has not been involved in any incident since that time. And as a matter of fact, when he first came into this country, there was a parole commission hearing where FBI agent Kaczynski, which is the expert on terrorism in this part of the country, testified on my father's behalf, saying that they have been following my father since he left the United States. He has had no ties to any organizations having to do with terrorism, has had no ties with violence, and up to this date, when he came into this country, has had no involvement in any terrorist activities. And due to that testimony, the parole commissioner decided to give him only 3 months parole which he was supposed to be out in the street on May 16th.
And your father, we should say, for anybody who should not know it, of course, had been in jail in Venezuela for, what, a decade, and then a year of sort of house arrest in Venezuela before he came here in March of 1988. Is that the right chronology?
Well, my father was in prison for almost 11 years, and he wasn't really under house arrest. What happened is that he needed time to get documentation together. The Venezuelan government held him until they could get his documentation together, at the same time supplying bodyguards for my father, knowing the danger involved in Venezuela with the Castro people, that my father might be killed there.
All right, well, I want to come back and talk about how your life's father may be in peril and jeopardy if, in fact, he should be deported. But, Oscar Levin, let me ask you, Judge William Hoovler, Federal District Judge William Hoovler, of course, has the case before him right now. What is the judicial status of the case?
The status is that we're filing an amended habeas corpus at this time in order to review the decision of the Justice Department. We're going to allege both procedural wrongdoing on the part of the Justice Department, as well as inconsistencies in the decision that they made. Bear in mind that the decision is totally an opposite to the decision that was made by Regional Commissioner Steve Martin, who had the opportunity to review the same file.
Regional INS, the Immigration Commissioner. We're dealing with a kind of an alphabet soup of government agencies here. I think that maybe we should make that clear.
Well, the Regional Commissioner of the Immigration Service had made an opposite decision, of which Commissioner Nelson, who's resigned now at this time, but he also
forced out, in fact.
He agreed with the decision. Basically, what we are now waiting for is we also filed a petition for a stay, and we're waiting for Judge Hoovler to rule on that position. He said he would decide by July 14th. Interestingly enough, the government said that they would not remove Dr. Bosch, but at the same time, they would not agree to a stay, which is often a typical tactic by the government, I believe, in order to attempt to take Dr. Bosch out of the jurisdiction of the Judge Hoovler, should they have the opportunity.
Well, in what jurisdiction could they possibly put this case then?
Well, I think the question is whether or not they can send Dr. Bosch to any other country. You know, our immigration system really depends upon some kind of reciprocity, where we have some other country who's willing to take the individual who we're deporting. In this case, the United States government has made it clear that they will not deport Mr. Bosch to Cuba. So the question then becomes, what other country will take him? And
which other is there a country?
I think let's look at it as a practical matter. He's been deported from Costa Rica. Costa Rica will not take him back. He's been deported from Venezuela. Venezuela will not take him back. The United States then has to find some other country who will undoubtedly perceive that this is not their problem. And this kind of thing is not actually unique to Mr. Bosch's case. It's something that happens generally with Cubans here in Florida who are ordered deported and for whom the Cuban government has no interest in taking back. Often what happens is that they are just released because they cannot go to any other country. It's happened to Afghanis who lived in Pakistan. The United States will not send them back to Afghanistan, and the Pakistani government will not take them. So in a way, it's not a unique situation. The question really is, can the United States government find a place and find a country which will accept Mr. Bosch?
Miriam, I spoke to a very powerful member of the Cuban-American National Foundation this past week, which in a sense has been strangely silent on this issue. There's been no formal statement from Jorge Mascanosa on this question of your father and his freedom. But another gentleman who is part of the foundation, I said, what are you doing? Are you going to try to find a country that would accept Dr. Bosch? And he said, we're looking into that. I mean, what country do you think conceivably, if it came to that, would accept your father? Do you know?
I don't know if there is a country that would, because I don't think there's any country that wants to be liable for his life. And that's the problem. I think that's one of the issues here, because any country that takes him, Castro has publicly declared, not only Castro, but the diplomats that left Cuba within the last year have come here and have told the media that my father will be executed the minute he's deported. And I think the countries are having problems dealing with, can we be responsible for this man's life?
Yeah. Now, I don't know where and when Fidel Castro said that, and I have no particular love for Fidel Castro, but it would seem to me on the face of it that to show that he is not a thug and a terrorist himself, that it would be in his best interest to see, in fact, that your father was kept alive Because if he were killed, I mean, we're speaking very hypothetically here, but if he left the United States and if he were murdered in some other country, Chile, let's say, for example, obviously the finger of blame would be pointed at Castro. It would seem to me that he would want to keep your father alive.
Castro doesn't care about the finger of blame. Castro has said for many years since my father left Cuba, that my father has a death sentence waiting for him. He's not concerned about where the finger of blame goes, obviously, because of what he's doing in Cuba to the Cuban people. So I don't think that, you know, I think he would kill him no matter what, and he said it.
Yeah. Oscar Levin, one of the legal problems I understand that you are facing here is that the ruling that the Justice Department has made puts Orlando Bosch in the category of being an excludable. Now, there are fewer legal remedies for you as an excludable, are there not?
There's, being excludable, you have very limited remedies available to you. It's much different than being in the deportation proceedings. However, we are seeking Judge Hoover to review the decision of the Justice Department. I don't think that the Attorney General had the authority to take the case away from Mr. Rifkin. The regulations allow for a final decision to be made by Steve Martin, which is a non-appealable decision. I think that they were afraid that they would look foolish appealing their own decision in federal court, and without authority and without regulation, they pulled the decision away from Mr. Rifkin after a decision has been made. And there is Supreme Court precedent to prevent the Attorney General's office or the Justice Department from taking away matters from an administrative agency if they don't like the decision that they made, and that's essentially what we feel is happening here.
Now, Ira Kurzban has just said a minute ago that he thinks that one possible way this may play out is that, in a sense, Dr. Bosch is simply, there's not going to be a country that will accept him, and that he'll simply be released here and will live with his family for the rest of his life.
That's a question more for the politicians to handle if it comes to that. My point is to represent Dr. Bosch in court, to represent that the government has not acted fairly, that has not offered him a fair opportunity for his asylum hearing, has not offered a fair opportunity for his withholding of deportation, and that they abused their discretion in the manner and the decision, both procedurally and substantively. Those are the issues that I will present before the court, before Judge Hoover, or before the 11th Circuit, or before the Supreme Court of the United States if it gets to that. As to where Dr. Bosch goes, should we be unfortunate and fail in our process, I'll leave that to the politicians to make.
Ira, it would seem to me, as a layman, but one who has followed some immigration cases, including yours, that it seems very unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to want to rule on this case. I don't see how this could get beyond the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, if it gets that far.
You know, to get to the Supreme Court, of course, it really depends on what technical issues can be raised. And, you know, Oscar's mentioned a number of issues which I think are interesting legal issues. And the Supreme Court may take it solely on that basis. I think the real question, though, is how strong is the government's case against Orlando Bosch? Obviously, if they can show that he has had a pattern of terrorist activity, and the government claims, you know, for example, that his terrorism not only extends to matters concerning Cuba, but because of what happened with the Polish freighter, there was a claim that he was involved in an attempt to assassinate Henry Kissinger. And the question is, how good are those claims? I mean, are they really meaningful claims or not? If they're not, hopefully they will be exposed in front of Judge Hoover. If they are, of course, I think the government's got a pretty strong case when you take that in combination with the claim that he was involved in blowing up a Cubana Airlines plane.
Right. And there are other accusations as well, that Cuban diplomats in Buenos Aires and another country, I forget which one, were the targets of some kind of an assassination plot. As Ira is saying here, the problem is that none of these have been, it's not been subject to an adversarial proceeding. Judge Hoover saw these when he decided to keep your father in jail, but you've never had a chance to contest those.
Michael, an interesting point concerning those allegations are that a year ago, the Immigration Service said that he should not be paroled into the United States because of these alleged claims. At that time, Judge Hoover upheld the decision not to parole him based on the same information that they had. After a year, or almost a year of studying that same information, Stephen Martin, the Regional Commissioner of the Immigration Service, found that that was not a valid position that they took. So right away, you already have the Immigration Service taking totally different positions.
How did, if I may interrupt, how did this case get taken away from immigration and get into the Justice Department?
That's a good question. One which we seek to inquire in court. Essentially what happened was that a memorandum was sent down to Mr. Rifkin's office.
This is Perry Rifkin, the district
director of immigration, telling him to immediately forward the Orlando Bosch file to the Justice Department, the Attorney General's office in Washington.
Well, you know, it's a tricky issue because if you look at how our immigration laws are written, the Attorney General has the authority to make every decision. And in effect, the district directors and the regional commissioners and even the Commissioner of INS makes those decisions in the name of the Attorney General. So the question here is, can the Attorney General take the authority over? And I think Oscar's, you know, raising a point as to whether or not once it's delegated to a district director or a regional commissioner or the commissioner, can the Attorney General step in and take the responsibility for himself? The statute indicates that the Attorney General, of course, makes all the decisions. There's nothing about a commissioner or about anyone else making these decisions. The regulations, though, indicate that they should be made by lower-level government officials because obviously the Attorney General is not going to make every decision about immigration law.
Sure.
And so you have an interesting issue here as to whether or not, when and under what circumstances the Attorney General can you know, delegate that authority and take it back, as he's done here. And that may be an issue that could get resolved in the Court of Appeals or even the Supreme Court.
If I may say something, as to what Mr. Kurzban said, these allegations that my father is accused of are only allegations and are hearsay. And I'm not a lawyer, but as far as from what I know, the courts don't go on hearsay in this country. And if they had any sort of evidence against my father, why haven't they charged him with it?
Well, let me just say two things about that. One is, there is some evidence, clearly, because your father was convicted of a crime here in the United States of using a 57mm bazooka to blow up a Polish freighter. So
But
it wasn't
he did
even,
his time
right,
for that.
that's quite right.
But he did not finish his probation, however. He violated the terms of his probation.
Absolutely, and he came back into this country to do good on that. And the other thing that I wanted to say, Mr. Kurzban mentioned about the Cubana Airlines, the plane, he was found not guilty by 5 tribunals on that already. He was already tried 3 times for the same crime and found not guilty.
And I would feel compelled to say as a journalist that he was found not guilty in Venezuelan courts. I don't know a thing about Venezuelan courts. I don't know what the standard of guilt and innocence is in Venezuela, but he certainly did spend a long time being tried on those charges, and he was found not guilty.
By all the courts, military courts, Supreme Court, civil court, every single court in Venezuela found him not guilty, no evidence against him.
All right, well, we're going to come back and talk about the charges and the future of Dr. Orlando Bosch in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newswatch. Today we are talking about the controversial Orlando Bosch case, and let me reintroduce my guests who are with me. Starting on my right, this is Ira Kurzban, a well-known immigration attorney, Miriam Bosch, daughter of Dr. Orlando Bosch, and Oscar Levin, who is one of the attorneys who represents Dr. Bosch. Miriam, this community in the past week, the Cuban-American community, has shown tremendous support for your father, for you, for your family members. And yet there is clearly a sentiment here in this community in South Florida that says we understand the human tragedy of the Orlando Bosch case, but we agree with the Justice Department. We at News 4 conducted a very unscientific poll. We asked our viewers to call in, call 2 numbers. If you agree he should be allowed to stay, call another if you don't. We got 9,400 phone calls. Again, it's unscientific, but 5,100 of those people who called said your father should not be allowed to stay. About 4,300 said he should. What do you say to that segment of the community that believes he should be deported and that he is a terrorist?
Well, the people that agree with the Justice Department's decision, first of all, don't know the Justice Department's decision, why or what it was based on. They don't realize that those 80 pages that we were given as an answer, a lot of those accusations and allegations come from a communist paper called Gramma from Cuba, and that this government is giving credibility to the Gramma newspaper. They don't, a lot of these people think that he was the one who blew up the plane because they don't listen. They don't read the fine print, found innocent. You know, they don't know what really happened. And you go outside and you ask people, what do you think of this man? And they tell you, he's the man that blew up the plane. They don't know that he was found not guilty. And I think that these people don't have enough information Because if they did have all the information and they still said he should be deported, then they don't believe in the justice system of this country, innocent until proven guilty.
We in this country, and I think in all civilized countries, we have deplored and continue to deplore as we should, I think, the Irish Republican Army killing innocents in Northern Ireland, the Syrians, the PLO, any acts of indiscriminate terrorism. Your father was stopped here in the 60s in his car. He had bombs. He said, I'm going to use these bombs to try to blow up buildings in Cuba. I mean, there's been a point in your father's life when he believed in violence. I mean, as Ira Kurzban said, he used a bazooka. He was part of a group, fired on a Polish freighter. He has been involved in acts which, in the broadest sense of the term, could be described as terrorist acts, though.
I think that the one act that my father was involved in and accused of at that time, he did his time for, number one. I think number two, I don't think there's any American in this country that will sit back and let communists take the United States of America and not fight back. I don't think there's anybody that will sit back and let the communist people come in and take their property, take their religion, split their family, take their freedom of speech, take away their creativity, and say, okay, here, take it without fighting back, because we in this country fight other people's wars as it is. We finance terrorism in other countries. There's a lot of things this government is involved in, and I think what my father did in that time frame, part of it was backed by the American government, as I said before, as a Bay of Pigs, etc., and the other part of it was out of frustration and just desperate to get freedom for his country.
All right, I would like to point out that I invited the United States Justice Department to be here to talk about the accusations against Dr. Bosch. They declined. I also invited, as far as we're talking about my invitations this week, I invited about 4 or 5 members, people who are so-called, and I believe leaders of the Anglo community, to come and to talk about why they believe probably your father should be deported, and all of them declined. There's clearly a large number of people who do not want to come on television or be quoted in the news media as saying that he should be deported. So this conversation, the participants, I'm glad you're all here, but I wish there were more people here to talk about this. Oscar Levin, you said a few minutes ago that the political process had intervened to take it out of the hands of INS. How about the political process intervening, say, from the White House to take it away from the Justice Department and overturn it? What's the possibility?
My understanding from reading the newspaper is that President Bush made a statement that he was not going to get involved in this matter until after the judicial process was completed.
Right.
And that's the only understanding that I have of the political process at that level.
Right. The president did tell the Miami Herald publisher Dick Capon this past week, and I did quote this. I wrote this down because I thought it would come up. He quotes the president as saying, I understand the emotions of this case, but I also hope that others understand our determination to stand up against terrorist acts. Miriam, if you and a group of Republicans go to the White House, that doesn't sound to me like President Bush is going to grant you your wish to pardon your father.
Well, you see, the problem is, I'd like for someone to tell me, where are the terrorist acts that he's committed in these past few years? Where are the acts that he's supposedly going to commit? If my father wanted to be involved in those activities and in those violent acts, my father could have stayed a free man anywhere in Central and South America, anywhere in Europe. But he didn't want to do that because my father doesn't believe in violence. He wanted to turn himself into this country, to do good on his parole violation and live the rest of his life with his family. That's all he wanted. He wanted to be a free man everywhere in the world, and he wanted to live peacefully.
Let me, if I may, just respond. I think you have to remember the government has the strongest case possible when they have a case of national security. They regard this as a national security case. They regard it as a case where they have somebody who's a terrorist. If they can prove those charges, and I think that's a big if, and that's the question that I think Miriam is raising, that the allegations are just that there's no substance to them. If they can prove those charges, they've got a very strong case, and the law is very clear that Orlando Bosch should be deported. The real question is whether or not they can prove those allegations, and those allegations are very, very serious. I mean, you have a situation here where somebody has been involved in terrorist activities from 1964 until 1976, and after that time he was in jail. So you have a person who throughout, for the last at least 20 years, has been involved, in the government's view, in terrorist activity, and the only exceptions have been is when he has been in jail. It is true that Orlando Bosch has not been involved in terrorist activities for 11 years, and that's because he's been in jail for 11 years. So if you believe the government's allegations, they have a very strong case. And the question is, though, I think you really have to look at those allegations, and I think that's what Oscar's saying, and that's what Miriam is saying. Just because it's reported that, and there were some pretty serious reports, I mean, about carrying bombs in Miami and being arrested for that, about being involved in an attempted assassination of Henry Kissinger. That's a pretty serious charge if the government has enough information. The second question really is, does the government have to prove it in the way we would have to prove it in a criminal case? And I would say, unfortunately, they do not. In other words, the government...
The allegations are simply enough in this case.
The government needs to only show, really, that there is some substance to the allegations. I think that's unfortunate because, and this happens all the time, and Oscar knows it too. I mean, the government has very different standards in immigration for proving cases with respect to questions of national security, whether or not somebody's involved in drugs. I mean, we get cases all the time where the government says, we believe that somebody assisted someone else in drugs based on an unsubstantiated DEA report. That is enough for the government to exclude somebody for the United States. And the same thing is true on national security grounds. So he's got a tough fight here. And he's got a tough fight because the standard is so low to prove the government's case. And that's unfortunate. And I agree with Miriam that I think, and Oscar, that it is unfortunate that that's what the standard is. But the truth is, that is the standard.
If I can just correct one thing, Mr. Kurzban said terrorist activities from 68 to 76. In 68, he was in prison for 4 years.
I said from 64.
From 64 to 76.
Yeah.
Okay,
except for the time he was in prison.
He was not accused, or there were no allegations
I want to
after
point
that.
something out, if I could, Michael, that Steve Martin's decision made a finding of fact that it was clear to him that Dr. Bosch was returning to the United States for the purpose of being reunited with his family. And that was his finding of fact, which I find an interesting finding in contrast with the Justice Department finding now. And then, you know, things are being categorized in a lot different fashion. In my understanding, everybody brings up the word bazooka. If I remember the indictment that I saw, it was a recoilless rifle, of which the possibility of harm to anybody was so nil that it was almost absurd. It was more
the shell bounced off the hull of the ship. I mean, the ship was not blown up, but it was the act itself.
We admitted the act itself, by the way, in our application with the Immigration Service, and we said it was a political statement made of frustration and, frankly, a harmless one at that. I couldn't see how that shell, that bounced off, as you categorize it, off a Polish freighter, could have even done any harm.
Yeah, put a little dent in it. Oscar, I'm gonna have to interrupt you. We are out of time. Miriam Bosch, thanks for being here, and we'll be following what happens to your father very closely, as well this community. Oscar Levin, thank you, and Eric Kurzban, as always, good to see you. And thank you for being with us too, and I invite you to join me here again next week on Newswatch. Until then, I'm Michael Putney. Hope you have a great 4th of July.